Welcome to the Barnes& Noble Book Club. We are so excited today to have David Nicholls.
Everyone. Hi there. Thank you for coming on.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marie Hendry, Publisher Liaison here at B&N. Thank you for joining today for our virtual book club event for David Nicholls, You Are Here. A few housekeeping notes. This is a conversation and there will be spoilers. If you haven't finished the book yet, we will post this on YouTube so you can come back once you've finished. If you have submitted questions through Eventbrite, we have them. You can also ask questions through the Q&A module. I'm going to turn it over to Lexie Smyth, our category fiction manager.
Thanks, Marie. We are so excited to be in conversation today with David Nicholls. David is the best-selling author of Starter for 10, The Understudy, One Day, which was recently adapted into a Netflix miniseries, and our June book club selection, You Are Here. He's been nominated for an Emmy and has won a BAFTA for Best Writer. Thank you so much for joining us today, David. Let's get into the book.
Oh, yeah, please. That's lovely.
Okay, so I understand that the book was inspired by some walks that you've taken. How did those walks start for you? And can you tell us about how some of them made their way into the book?
Sure. I've spent a lot of time in the wind and the rain on the Yorkshire moors and the dales and the peaks, and it's something I've always loved. Um, a short time ago, actually, about 10 or 11 years ago, my kids refused to come walking with me anymore. We'd no more hiking holidays. So I started going on these long walks by myself. I found them really useful as a way to think about writing and just to spend time alone and spend the whole day pretty much in silence. And it became a bit of a ritual, something I did every year. And someone suggested that maybe I write a nonfiction book about it. And I've always been very wary of writing anything too personal, anything like a memoir. So I thought maybe there might be a novel in it, a kind of a walk is like a story. You have a beginning, a middle, and then you take all kinds of unexpected twists and turns. You have big set pieces and quieter moments. You have good days and bad days. I like the idea that the structure of a long walk in particular might reflect the structure of a novel. So then I started to think, what kind of novel might it be? Originally, it was going to be a family drama. Lots of secrets and lies coming out in the wilderness. Um, and then I got the idea that maybe a romantic comedy would be fun. We always think of romantic comedies as being urban and metropolitan, and I like the idea of two people uh, getting to know each other in the middle of a field in the rain. That seemed like it might be a fun idea. So it was a desire to write about my own experience of walking and a desire to maybe find a different approach to telling a love story, finding a different setting.
So you mentioned your own experience of walking. Have you yourself walked coast to coast?
I have, yes, yeah. I did. I thought about a lot of walks. I thought, how long does this story need to be for them to really get to know each other? And it felt like it needed, at least 10 days. Usually when I go walking by myself, it's just for 3 or 4 days, usually in Yorkshire or Northumberland or the lakes. But this felt like it needed something more significant. And the coast to coast has a wonderful structure to it. It's almost like there's something very symbolic about walking from east to the west and doing the whole thing, and the landscape changes as you go. I don't know if anyone watching this has ever done a walk, but it's very much a walk of 3 acts. You have the lakes, which are beautiful, dramatic, often wet. Then you have in the middle the Dales and the Pennines, which is a slightly softer landscape, very beautiful. That felt like a place where they could really get to know each other. And then finally you have the moors, which have a kind of very austere, quite bleak beauty. And so I like the idea of a 3 act structure reflected in the landscape. So I did the walk myself. I had a notebook with me. I didn't really take many notes. Various things did happen along the way. And it was almost as if the landscape was contributing ideas to the novel. So there's the scene in the novel where they think about swimming. You
Oh,
come
yeah.
upon that lake as a writer and you think, well, what could happen here? What might the conversation be? What might the tension be? So the landscape is something that I've experienced at first hand, and it was wonderful to kind of to have that conversation with the landscape and to try and imagine what what the circumstances might contribute to the story. So in the novel, when they have the horrible, horrible climb over the valley into the next valley on day 2, that was absolutely my experience. It was the coldest, the wettest I've ever been in my life. It was truly horrible. And you're simultaneously thinking, I want this to stop, and oh, this would make a great chapter. So that's often for me my experience of research. Even the worst things that happen to you contribute to the ideas.
I mean, it did seem horrible.
Marie and I,
Portion of it.
we talked about this, and neither one of us is particularly outdoorsy. So in many ways, this would be a big struggle for the two of
Yeah,
us.
lead
I
to
can't tell you.
breakups probably.
Yeah, I mean that thing of getting to your hotel room and wringing out your clothes and feeling completely like you've just climbed out of a river. It was terrible, and at the same time, that my experience, my relationship to the countryside is much more like Michael's. I love it, but at times like that, I'm pure Marnie. I think, why am I doing this? This is horrible. I want to get out. So both of those sides are within me, I guess.
So
That
some
actually,
colorful swearing then.
Yeah, there was very much so. Yeah, just by myself. So it was. It
Yeah.
was. I was the only one offended.
you've set us up great for our next question, which is now that we
Sure.
know a little bit about the walks that inspired the book, whose voice came to you first? The two main characters have such distinct voices, and I'm wondering if one of them came to you first and then the other was in response to that. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of writing these two characters?
Oh, it's such an interesting question. I guess I thought that if you write a novel which is two people who love walking and they go on a walk, that's not a novel. There's nothing there. There's nothing really for them to do except enjoy the experience. So I knew that there would need to be one person who didn't want to be there. And it occurred to me, I live in London. I'm very much an urban dweller, and that it was important that someone really was the fish out of water. And I also like the idea that that person might change their mind and that they might need someone to kind of not teach them, but draw them out of that point of view. And so you think, well, who might that be? So the idea of it being someone who literally studies the landscape for work seemed like a good idea. So for Marnie, I needed someone who was very interior and very urban, and I thought about and perhaps a little solitary. So the idea of books, which again is something that I feel strongly about and love very much, that occurred to me, and maybe that was Marnie's profession, or maybe it was her passion. And similarly with Michael, I needed a reason for him to be spending quite so much time alone. So you start to think a little bit about his backstory. So they actually kind of originated, they almost developed in parallel. Um, I guess it's true to say that Marnie's voice was much more immediate when I wrote the novel. In the first draft of the novel, I mean, we'll talk about this a bit more, but Michael was a little bit too morose. He was very, very, very interior, very, very, very quiet, very, a little more, a little lacking in humor. So my editor, my very brilliant editor, Fede, said, let's make their conversations more fun. So it's not funny chapter, sad chapter, funny chapter, sad chapter. So Michael took a little bit more work. And Marnie's, I guess, is the more immediate voice. But as the drafts continued, I started to like Michael more and more and more. That was it felt to me important that you were rooting for him as much as you were excited about hearing more from Marnie's humorous voice.
That really leads into you're giving us so many nice segues into our questions. This is
It's almost
amazing.
planned.
We, our beloved Marnie and Michael have both been knocked out by life. Can you talk about Marnie's impulse to turn inward and stay home versus Michael's attempts to find solitude in the natural world? You touched a bit, but they're just so interesting to us.
Yeah, it's very interesting that often you often inspiration will come from my own life, even though I'm not writing autobiographically. So Marnie's solitude, I guess, was I had that experience of looking at the camera roll and thinking, what happened to my friends? My photographs were almost universally of my children, and my kids got to the point where they no longer wanted their photograph taken, and suddenly my photo reel was just dry cleaning receipts and kind of retail issues. And I realized pretty much as a result of lockdown of COVID that I'd become rather antisocial. And this isn't really a lockdown novel, but I did find that my key response to the pandemic was that I really, really, really missed the countryside because in the UK you weren't allowed to travel unnecessarily, and even into the open air. You weren't allowed to get on a train to travel, and I missed it so much. So I was aware of how much I longed to be outside. And I was also aware of how socially awkward I became very, very quickly. I wanted during lockdown to write a contemporary novel just at the point where contemporary life became unrecognizable. It was very, very hard to write a book set in 2020. And so I felt like I was sort of in limbo, really, waiting for the world to settle. And I gave up writing. And I also became aware that because I wasn't seeing my friends as much, that the kind of fuel, the kind of inspiration and excitement I get from social contact also disappeared. And so I guess that's the roots of Marnie's dilemma. I managed to had a very comfortable life during lockdown. I was with my family. We got on pretty well. I read. I was involved in their schooling. All of that was great. But I was very, very, very nervous of seeing my friends. And I realized that a lot of the things that we did to make lockdown life bearable, the little routines, watching movies, films, all of those non-social activities, while wonderful, it was almost a trap that I felt I was falling into. So I guess that's the root of it, really. I recognized the value of friendship to me as a writer as well as a human being and how important that was. And but I could also see the potential of withdrawing from that, which is what Marnie has done.
So another character that we really loved was Cleo. We thought
Yeah.
it was really interesting that she was able to stay neutral in the dissolution of Michael and Natasha's marriage, only really wanting the best for everyone involved. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to write a character like that?
Yeah, I love Cleo too. I mean, I wanted to write about, one of those people who's a kind of social engine, keeps everyone together, keeps everyone active, keeps everyone moving, keeps everyone's spirits up, to the point where can become a little bit overbearing. That thing of being the life and soul of the party in your 20s is one thing. And as you get into your 40s or 50s, it takes on a different quality. Um, and I wanted also to write someone who really loved them both. They're very, very different characters, Michael and Marnie. And if they were put together, if they were sat down in a restaurant opposite each other, it really wouldn't work, which is why Cleo sets them up with other people. She can't quite see it seems improbable as a romantic relationship, which of course is what you need if you're going to write a story. If you put two people together and they get on great, there's no story. So I like the idea that Cleo really loves them both but can't see it. That seemed to me to be important. And I loved her. I think I was interested in the kind of power relationship. She's quite a kind of she she's a wonderful person, but also quite insensitive about certain things. She's not she's not always brilliant. I mean, she's very angry still about Marley's unsuccessful marriage. She's sometimes a little bit insensitive about things like money or the fact that Marley doesn't have children, and that seemed to me an interesting friction. Um, Friends that we really, really love can also send us crazy. And I wanted to write that, to write a friendship that was supportive and loving and nurturing, but also had a little bit of friction to it. And that seemed to be more interesting than just someone who was constantly, hugging her.
Yeah, I think that's what makes all of your characters seem so real. Like Cleo seems like a real person. She's a real friend. And the friendships
Mm.
are one of our favorite things about the book. And you touch on something early on that really resonated for us. When talking about Cleo and Michael's friendship, there's a line, while it was touching to be looked after, it was humiliating too. I think we've all been there, but can you talk a bit about what you meant here?
Yeah, I guess that friendship, perhaps it's the case. I don't know if this is true, but friendship is never entirely mutual. That there are shifting, power relationships and structures and habits and ticks and in a friendship, even in a great friendship, and that yeah, even something as wonderful as the love of a friend can become oppressive or overbearing or teeter into bullying. I guess one of Marnie's qualities is a kind of a lack of self-confidence. He doesn't always um, he's not always quite as I'm one of Marnie is so witty and smart, and yet she feels insecure about not having been to university. She's embarrassed about making the bad choice in her 20s in terms of her partner, in terms of her husband. And so I like the idea of someone who um, everyone around them can see their potential, but they can't actually see it themselves. I guess that's the quality she shares with Emma in One Day, that lack of self-confidence. And Cleo, on the other hand, is supremely confident. And I do think it feels strongly that it's a positive friendship, but it's a friendship that sometimes can teeter over into something that maybe is a little bit uneven.
So moving into something a little bit different, another thing that struck me is that in the Michael sections of the book, he seems to think that he's going to be able to walk off his wife leaving him by doing this coast
Yeah,
to coast
yeah.
journey. And I'm curious if you think that the walks actually help Michael to process what's going on for him, or if they're just a form of avoidance.
That's very interesting. I mean, I guess that also comes a little bit from personal experience. Not in that, that's certainly not my domestic situation, but the spur for me starting to walk was my father dying about 11 years ago, 11 years ago, in fact. And I found it very hard to. I was surprised that my response to that was a desire to do exactly what Michael does, just to walk out the door and keep walking. And at the same time, I'm also a little skeptical about this idea of walking things off. I think it can look a little bit like running away, can't it? It can look a little bit like just not wanting to confront a problem. It's almost a kind of literal escape from a dilemma, and so I think there's huge value in walking and being in nature. But I was also aware, particularly when I was writing this, that sometimes people perhaps place a little too much importance on it and think of it as a cure. So I personally, in my own experience, uh, found that it helped up to a point, and that actually it was far better to go home and to talk and to have conversations. I guess this is the tussle in this novel, is to recognize the beauty of the landscape and the value of walking and independence and reading and all of those solitary activities, and at the same time celebrating the power of conversation, because ultimately that's the thing that does improve Michael and Marnie. It's openness, it's connection, it's conversation. And so that's also, I think, initially why I didn't want to write a nonfiction book about solitary walking, because you need those arguments, you need those difficult conversations, you need those frivolous conversations, you need the laughter. So I wanted to write a book that was a celebration of conversation. The working title for this book was Walking and Talking, and those things aren't in opposition. In fact, it's the combination of them that really helps Michael and Marnie to escape from their dilemmas.
I love walking and talking.
It's a good title. My
Yeah.
first titles are never my final titles. I have every book I've ever written that I've changed the title, but I could have gone with Walking and Talking. But I think You Are Here is maybe a tiny
Yeah.
bit better. Looks
Yeah,
better on a jacket. Yeah.
it feels so special. I mean, speaking of the relationship between Michael and Natasha, on my first read through the book, I was so angry at Natasha
Mm.
for leaving Michael at such a low
Yeah.
point in their lives. But on my second read through this past weekend, I found myself feeling much more sympathetic to what she must have been struggling with on her own. Was it difficult to explore the dissolution of their marriage in that way?
It's those questions are so interesting because you make all kinds of decisions when you assemble a book, when you structure a book, and it would have been perfectly possible to go into flashbacks, for instance, to see firsthand what was going on in that house,
Mhm.
to see the conversations, to see the arguments, to see Natasha trying to help Michael and failing, to see those things as chapters with dialogue. But in the very early stages of planning a novel, you have to make quite bold decisions. And the bold decision here was, never to go into certain points of view, only ever to stay with Michael and Marnie, and also to write about them in the third person, not the first person, to observe them rather than become them. And those conversations mean that there are things that you only see one half of the story, and you're not telling the Natasha story. You're not telling
Mhm.
giving her experience. You're only ever recounting it, what Michael knows. And so it is very, it's absolutely a danger that the characters that you, the novelist, feel very sympathetic towards, sometimes the reader feels differently about. But I'm pleased that in the second reading she seemed more sympathetic. I mean, I think the love is genuine, but because you never see them, having conversations or having that, you never see the early stages of their relationship, you never see them falling in love, you only ever see rather bruised Michael's point of view, then you're always going to have a particular take. But in my mind, all of those other scenes did exist, and she was a really sympathetic character. So it's this very interesting aspect of writing fiction, the selection of material. But I'm pleased you came around to it. I loved writing that scene, their final, what might be their final encounter. But it also seemed important to me that to suggest that their relationship was going to be better in the future, and I imagine that it will be. Personally, I think it's actually it definitely improves, and they do become friends in my head anyway.
Well, that's good to know because speaking of that final encounter, I mean, their fertility journey is very real and clearly puts a
Mm.
strain on their relationship. And she knew that, and she knew that he is a sensitive person. So why do you think she thought it would be best to tell him about the pregnancy in person? Like, why not um, give him a little heads up so he didn't feel quite
Yeah.
so taken aback? It kind of seemed like a slap in the face.
No, I can see that. I guess again, sometimes you make a decision that actually is for the benefit of the drama. You know what I mean? I
Mhm.
mean, it would be absolute, as you say, it would absolutely be possible for her to go via Clio, or to write a letter, or to prepare him on the phone. All of those things would be possible. But sometimes, as a novelist, you think, I could write that, but I'm going to cut it because it's much, much better for things. It's always better for things to be, to show, not to tell, for things to happen on the page in real time. And sometimes that might lead to a compromise in, not plausibility, but in, a certain amount of what, in its worst case, might be contrivance, but hopefully that's outweighed by the benefit of seeing these things happen on the page in front of the reader, kind of in real time, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and right, like as a person, people make mistakes, so she may have thought she was doing the right thing and making the right
Yeah.
call, and only after the fact she was maybe in her car, like, maybe I should
Yeah,
have given him a heads up.
yes, we could have had a conversation on the phone.
Yeah.
Yes, no, absolutely.
Thing that I really loved in the book were these small realizations that Marnie and Michael have about how being alone has changed them. The scene where Michael realizes that washing his socks and his underwear every night might be kind of depressing. Marnie's little strange language of sounds. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came up with these details and why it was important to you to include them?
Well, I love that kind of thing. Before I start writing chapter one, I spend a long time, I mean, a year at least, making notes and little, sometimes it'll just be a little line or an observation or a little piece of behavior that seems significant. What's in Marnie's fridge, what Michael eats, how he eats, the fact that no one watches him eating, so he eats in a particular way, what he watches on TV, what his viewing history is. All of that stuff accumulates, and I write about 20, 30,000 words of notes before I write the story. And I guess that you hope that everything you put in the novel serves a purpose, and the purpose is to make the characters feel real and recognizable. And for the reader, hopefully, not always, but sometimes to say, oh, I know what that feels like, or I've done that myself. So I don't, when I go on long walks, I take enough socks and underwear not to have to wash them every night in the sink, I promise you. But it's a very good indicator of character for someone who has perhaps been living by themselves in a particular way that they wouldn't, living in a way that they wouldn't if their life was as it once had been. So those things accumulate, and you select them and you put them in the novel, and some things you leave behind. But it's all in the interest of making them feel real. Um, Having said that, one of the notes I got from my very smart editor was the washing his socks and pants thing was a running joke. So it happened every single chapter. And my editor very quickly said, "Don't do that. Let's just have that happen once. Don't make it a running joke." That we only need to see that and the one time. So yeah, those things that's what I love about writing. Just finding those little details that will land and will ring true and will reveal character without feeling contrived or over the top.
Yeah, everybody has their weird little quirks, and we just get to
Yeah,
see them with Marty and Michael because they're the only ones we see.
absolutely. I mean,
Um,
the little noises
yeah,
is something I do. I mean, the kind of I spend 9 hours a day by myself, and so I do mutter. As a writer, I kind of need the solitude, and so I do have a little kind of I will talk to the kettle, or I will make little noises when I stand up from sitting at the desk, and so those things are personal as well.
well, that's good to know because I do that too. So it's less weird that
Good,
there's other people who
good.
make little noises. We are into our Marnie section. We've got a lot of
Yeah.
questions here. So, like, Marnie is definitely more open to finding new love than Michael is, even if she doesn't realize it. She's really funny, but it also becomes very clear that humor is a form of deflection for her, particularly when she talks about her marriage. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit how you developed that part of her?
Yeah, I guess I was kind of drawing, you draw on a lot of things when you're coming up with characters, and for me, part of the a tradition that I draw on a lot is movies. I love I love particularly classic American screwball comedy, romantic comedy. I love that. I love the greats in that genre. I love When Harry Met Sally and The Awful Truth and The Philadelphia Story and The Lady Eve, and there's a particular kind of smart, wisecracking tradition that I adore. I think a lot about. I once wrote an adaptation of my favorite play is Much Ado About Nothing, my favorite Shakespeare play, and Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing, who is rather distant and observes things, but is always the smartest person, even if she's not the noisiest person. And so I guess Marnie is for me, part of a tradition. Um, I have worked with copy editors, and they're really brilliant, and I find that job really, really fascinating. So I love the idea of writing a copy editor. And I think her relationship with books was something that I could understand as well. A sense of not escape, but also a kind of fierce critical intelligence, and a mind that's much, much sharper than her educational qualifications suggest. That's something that seemed important to her as well. That she could have been brilliant, but because of particular decisions when she was younger, she wasn't able to fulfill her potential. So a combination of those things helped to create Marnie. But I guess I was kind of drawing on a kind of Jane Austen tradition much more consciously than I have in the past. I read during lockdown Persuasion, and which is the great novel of second chances and love later in life. And there was something about Anne Elliot's kind of cool observation that seemed to fit Marnie. So if people think that, I mean, characters in Jane Austen don't swear as much as Marnie, but for me, she's definitely part of that tradition as well of kind of watchfulness and wryness and wit.
It was also really interesting to see the way she was with Conrad versus the way she was with Michael, like right off the bat. It seemed like she was a lot more comfortable with Michael than
Yeah,
she
yeah.
ever was with Conrad. Is it because she didn't initially see him in a romantic way, or are there other reasons why she was more comfortable with him?
But more comfortable with Michael. I
Michael,
guess
yeah.
yeah, I think I was very also another kind of yeah, I think it was to do with a sense that she doesn't initially find him particularly attractive and is rather dismissive initially, but recognizes the quality of kindness and gentleness and you know it's very significant that Conrad doesn't ask her any questions. You know, he's not interested in her job. He doesn't even she at least feigns an interest in the things that Conrad loves, and he doesn't do the same in return. He's not interested in books or following her conversational leads. And Michael very quickly is. You know, another adaptation I worked on years ago was a film of Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd. And I guess probably I'm a little bit influenced by the relationship between Bathsheba and Gabriel Oak in that novel, whether people know that novel. It's a wonderful novel, where she initially dismisses Gabriel Oak as a little bit uninteresting, a little bit beneath her, a little bit not as witty or as warm as he actually is. And I liked that idea that gradually there's a realization, a slow realization, the more they talk. Um, so I guess you know in love stories you're always looking for obstacles, and the obstacle here is Michael's reticence and withdrawal from conversation initially. He takes a little while to open up.
I think one of my favorite parts of the development of the relationship between Michael and Marnie is how Marnie didn't feel concerned about what she said after telling Michael about both her marriage and her divorce, and that
Yeah,
instead she felt content not because she had talked about it, but because she'd been listened to. And I think
yeah.
that's such a true feeling. And I guess I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about the importance of listening as an action in this book, because it that just I keep going back to that moment when I think about this book.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, as I said, it was called Walking and Talking, and I wanted to write about a particular kind of conversation. You know, as I said earlier, if they went on a date, it would be a disaster because that thing of sitting opposite each other in a restaurant, it's a performance. You know, you're literally performing to the other person. You face on like an audience and a performer. And and my experience of walking, the conversations that you have if you walk in companies, you're looking around, you're looking in different ways, you're talking and listening in an entirely different way, in a way that can feel quite profound. And so yeah, it seems important to me that they don't slip into it's not therapy quite, but there is a sense that the other person is taking it in and responding. And i- Marnie never really loses that thing of performance. You know, the story she tells about her marriage is not quite the truth. You know, the truth is a little bit dark. It is darker. And she doesn't say everything, but what she does say is heard. And she does find herself saying things that she's previously only thought, which again I think is a mark of a good conversation, that you're almost surprised at what you're revealing. So that thing she says about her regret about pouring all this love into the wrong relationship, that she would have liked to have loved the right person, that it feels like a waste, you know, almost like something spilt on the ground. That idea takes Marnie by surprise. The fact that she says it out loud to another person, and I think that's almost the point in the novel where she starts to think this might be something more. When she's surprised at her own openness and her own frankness and honesty, even if it's not the complete truth.
Yeah, he just makes her feel so safe. And it's so nice to
Yeah.
see that. And I'll say too, like I've read this book twice, and both times I had to pause. My heart skipped a beat when Marnie thinks, if he asks me, I will. I will stay with him and walk into the sea. I love that line so much. I like want to tattoo it on my arm. It's beautiful. Are there
Oh,
any
thank you.
versions of the story where he does summon up the courage to ask her to stay?
Well, I could talk for the whole 45 minutes about what happens during the rewriting process, but the original novel, it felt absolutely essential to me that they did the whole walk. So in the first
Mhm.
draft, he comes back to London, but only for 2 days. And then there were a couple of, conversations on the phone, and she changes her mind and she decided that she's going to surprise him. And then she can't find him. And then the last chapter of the novel is a kind of chase. And then the novel ended on the beach at the end of the walk in Yorkshire. And it felt too quick. It felt as if she'd forgiven him way too quickly. And I did two or three different versions of that ending, and it never really worked because each of them uh, belittled Marnie because she forgave him too quickly. And
Mhm.
so it felt like it needed longer, it needed that passage of time for them both to realize what they'd lost and to have regrets. And so that was a big breakthrough for me as in working through the drafts. So there was never the other thing that which didn't happen in the first draft is they didn't kiss at the pub. They didn't have that kind of they didn't have the landlady knocking on the door.
I
So it
love
was a
that
much
so
more
much.
yeah, well, it was a much more chaste relationship, and actually it was maddening. You thought, well, this is ridiculous. Yes, he's reticent, but he's not that reticent. He needs to do something. So that was a very, very good note as well. So those were the two big. Interestingly, the changes which I applied relate to what you've just asked. He always he always he never quite comes out with it, but he has longer to think about it, and he takes things a little bit further in the second draft than the first draft. He was a little bit too buttoned up in the first draft, so it was a good change. And I liked also the idea. Frankly, by the end of the novel, you didn't want him to walk for another 4 days. There were 4 more days of maps of walking, and it was getting really boring. So it also seemed like a good idea editorially for him to give up and go home, and then for them to meet again in a different environment.
You're setting me up for my next question. You know, the book has all of the traditional beats of a romantic comedy, but the ending you landed on, it was really unexpected for me. I loved it. Um,
Mm.
I would love for you to talk a little bit about how you arrived at that ending and how it wasn't 100% clear that they end up together. Like, we hope they will. It seems like they will, but you didn't tie it in a bow. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that process.
think I think I guess that I love, as I say, I love romantic comedy as a genre, but I've never been very good at happy endings. I always sort of think you spend a lot of a novel putting obstacles in the way of characters getting together. That's what a novel is. It's how they're going to overcome these obstacles. And I'm always troubled by endings where suddenly the obstacles evaporate, where suddenly the differences in circumstances, the fact that he lives in the north of England, she lives in the south, the fact that there are that there are work reasons and reasons she can't quite imagine him in London. Is she going to move to Yorkshire? I'm not sure. The idea that you kind of all of these difficult questions that you've carefully laid down to keep your characters apart, that they will vanish. It has always troubles me, and so I tend to write endings, I guess, that are either quite downbeat or are a little bit more. Well, let's wait and see. But I do think it's strange to talk about the ending. I always try and avoid it, but we can talk about it here. I do think it is a happy ending. I have my own version of what happens, and I wouldn't want to reveal that. But I do think it's a positive ending. I do think of it as an upbeat moment. And this what the shirt is on the last page, what the white shirt is a yes. It's her way of saying yes, let's try. Not yes, let's succeed or yes, let's get married, but yes, let's try. And that's to me is as I suppose as far as I'm happy to go towards a romantic comedy ending with these characters.
I mean, we were going to ask you what is next for them because I mean, so like she has such a beautiful way of pulling him out of his shell, and he makes this grand gesture of taking the kids to London instead of on
Yeah.
another walk. And like Lexie said, we're really satisfied with the ending. The reconciliation felt beautiful. The shirt, now he has two shirts.
Mm.
Felt so nice and special, but we still were like, oh, I want more.
You want more?
Do they,
Yeah.
how does the rest of the walk go? What do they do next? But it sounds like you don't want to tell us.
Well, no, I did write the rest of the walk, but like I said, it was too much. It was
Yeah.
quite boring, and and I guess, and I also took the relationship a little bit further. But it felt like it was better to leave it on a kind of ellipsis, you know, a kind
Yeah.
of to be continued, which it won't be. I mean, I'm not going to write a sequel or anything, but I would like. I think I'm doing my best to send out positive signals in that last chapter. But at the same time, it felt very, very important for Marnie's dignity that she shouldn't give him too easy a ride. You know, she shouldn't just kind of concede or be too easygoing or affectionate. So to me, that certain kind of distance that's still there between them at the end is a positive because it means that they're both remaining true to themselves, or she in particular is remaining true to herself.
It
Yes,
certainly comes through that way.
it spoke to
Great,
the growth she made over the course of the book.
good.
Um,
I'm pleased.
we are coming up on time, so we have one last question for you
Sure.
before we start to wrap things up. What do you want your readers to take away from this book?
Oh, what an interesting question. I mean, that question, I don't necessarily have a conscious answer. I guess with this book, you know, the spirit of this book was optimistic. I was writing it while we were working on the TV version, the Netflix version of One Day, and I love that story. But I wanted to write something that was um, joyous and you know that had a melancholy quality to it, but was a novel of spring. You know, it's strange that my previous novel, Sweet Sorrow, which was a novel I'm very proud of, the starting point for that novel was the idea of the end of summer, the last day in August, that feeling when the leaves are turning and you realize it slipped through your fingers and you haven't quite achieved all you wanted to. And it was a very melancholy. That novel had a particularly melancholy ending about time passing and nostalgia. And I thought with this book, let's let go of nostalgia, let's let go of melancholy, let's try and have something that's about hope. It felt a reaction, almost a reaction to the pandemic in that respect. I wanted it to be about connection and the future. And so I hope that that's what people take from it, a kind of a gentleness, a kind of a sense of optimism, a sense in the value of other people and the value of conversation, and if people also, you know, buy a pair of walking boots and look to see where they might go for a hike, that's wonderful too. I wanted to express my own passion for the landscape and for nature. But mainly the keynote was that there is a value in human conversation and connection that can't be underestimated. And if the pandemic taught us anything, it's that you know that there can be a danger in loneliness, not in solitariness, but in loneliness, and that connection and communication is our best hope to escape that.
I think that that shines through in this novel. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining us today,
Thank you
David.
for your
This
questions.
was such a wonderful conversation, and thank you so much for writing such a wonderful book. As a
Oh,
reminder to
very
everyone
kind.
in the audience, we'll be back on August 6th for our next virtual event, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you again, David. Thank you, everyone. We'll
Thank you
see
for
you again
coming.
next
Thank
time.
you, David.
And thank you for your questions. It was lovely to talk to you all. Thank you for coming, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.